A note before we begin. What follows is a modern interpretive narration built from real Mesopotamian mythology. The Sumerian god Enki, the Atrahasis flood epic, the concept of the me, and thousands of years of comparative myth. It is not a transcript of a literal document. No such sequence of 9 tablets exists. This is a meditation in the voice of legend, not a history lesson pretending to be one. Consider it a piece of mythic storytelling, the kind humans have always used to ask big questions about themselves. Prologue. The one who spoke from the deep. Before we begin the first message, we need to understand the figure behind it. Enki was not simply a name written into ancient clay. He was, to the people who first shaped his story, something closer to an idea wearing the mask of a god. The idea that knowledge itself might have a will, a memory, and a plan. Today, information is cheap. Any question can be answered in seconds. A phone in a pocket holds more recorded knowledge than the great library of any ancient king. But it was not always like this. For most of human history, knowledge was the most fragile thing in the world. It lived inside the minds of the old. It lived in the hands of craftsmen, passed from master to apprentice through years of watching and repeating. It lived in songs sung at funerals, and in the specific cadence a priest used when he read the sky. And when the people who carried that knowledge died, in a plague, a war, a famine, a flood, the knowledge simply stopped. It did not retreat into a backup. It did not wait in a cloud server to be recovered. It vanished as completely as breath. This is the terror that runs beneath nearly every ancient civilization's oldest stories. Cities that took 10 generations to build could be reduced to dust in a single one. Languages spoken by millions could shrink within 2 or 3 centuries to a handful of scratches on broken stone that no living person could read. The Egyptians built what they called houses of life, a phrase historians still use for the temple scriptoriums where sacred and scientific texts were copied and safeguarded. The Greeks built schools that tried to keep philosophy and mathematics alive across the collapse of empires. Indian scholars memorized entire cosmologies, syllable by syllable, so that a single dropped generation could not erase what 10 generations before them had learned. Every civilization that endured did so because someone, somewhere, refused to let the knowledge die with them. And in the marshy plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Sumerians did something unprecedented. They did not simply memorize, they carved. Writing, in its earliest known form, begins here, not as poetry, not as scripture, but as inventory. Grain counts, beer rations, temple debts. It is almost comic in hindsight that the species' first attempt to freeze thought in permanent form was born out of bookkeeping. But bookkeeping became story. Story became law. Law became myth. And within a few centuries, the same wedge-shaped marks that once tracked barley were being used to record the shape of the universe, the names of kings, the movements of the stars, and the actions of gods. Among the gods who fill those tablets, one figure stands apart, not because he commands storms, like the sky fathers of so many other pantheons, not because he leads armies, like the war gods worshipped in 100 other temples. Enki's power was never about force, it was about understanding. The Sumerians described him as the keeper of something called a difficult word to translate cleanly, but one that roughly meant the underlying principles that made civilization possible: craftsmanship, music, law, writing itself, kingship, the rites of burial, the rules of hospitality. In the Sumerian imagination, these were not simply human customs that people had stumbled into over time. They were treated as structures, almost like laws of physics for society, that existed prior to any city and that had to be given, distributed, or discovered before a city could function at all. Enki was the one who held them, who understood their shape, and who was, in several surviving myths, generous, sometimes recklessly generous, about handing them out. He was also, in nearly every telling, a god of water, not the destructive floodwater of a storm god's wrath, but the deep, hidden freshwater the Sumerians called the Abzu. The underground reservoir they believed fed every spring, well, and river on the surface. For a civilization that lived and died by irrigation, in a landscape where the rivers that gave life could just as easily drown a season's harvest, it made a kind of poetic sense that the god of deepest understanding would also be the god of the water no one could see. The most important things the Sumerians seem to believe are rarely on the surface. They are underneath. You have to dig, or wait, or listen, before they rise to meet you. It's in Enki's relationship to humanity itself that the mythology gets genuinely strange and genuinely moving. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest flood narratives in the world, the minor gods grow exhausted from millennia of hard labor, digging canals, tending the earth, doing the grinding physical work the universe apparently requires. They rebel, and the solution the gods arrive at is humanity, a new kind of being, made from clay and divine blood, created explicitly to take over the burden of labor so the gods could rest. On the surface, this is a story about humans as tools. Useful tools, perhaps even cherished tools, but tools nonetheless, created for a function, not for their own sake. But Enki, across dozens of surviving fragments and later retellings, does not seem to see it that way. He is consistently portrayed as humanity's advocate inside the divine court, the one who argues for their protection, who intervenes on their behalf, who treats the newly made beings as something worth more than their labor. And this tension comes to a head in the most famous story connected to his name, the flood. Long before there was a Noah, there was a man the Sumerians called Atrahasis, and a slightly different version of the same figure the Babylonians called Utnapishtim. In both versions, the senior gods, tired of humanity's noise, its growth, its refusal to stay small, decide to wipe the species out with a flood. And in both versions, Enki breaks ranks. He does not stop the flood. He does not have that authority, but he warns one man. He gives him instructions. He ensures that something survives the water, not just a body, but a memory, a lineage, a thread of continuity between the world before the catastrophe and whatever comes after. Whether this story preserves some genuine memory of an ancient regional flood, whether it is pure allegory, or whether it is something in between, is a real and ongoing scholarly question. What matters for our purposes is simpler. Across nearly every surviving telling, the figure of Enki is not defined by power. He is defined by a specific, repeated choice. The choice to give people what they were not supposed to have. Knowledge withheld by the powerful, handed quietly to the ones who needed it most. This is the foundation on which the following 9 messages are built. Not because archaeologists dug up 9 tablets in a sealed chamber somewhere beneath the Iraqi desert. They did not. But because if you sit with everything the Sumerians believed about this god, his obsession with preserving what could be lost, his willingness to defy the powerful on behalf of the powerless, his conviction that understanding is worth more than obedience, a certain kind of question starts to form. What would a being like that actually want to say to us? Not as scripture, not as law, as a letter. What follows are 9 such letters, imagined, composed, offered in the spirit of that ancient figure, but written for anyone standing in the present moment, looking backward at 10,000 years of human striving, and asking, honestly, what was all of this for? They are not about power, they are not about domination, they are about identity. And before we can understand the universe around us, the first message insists, we have to understand ourselves. Message 1. I did not make you without purpose. Why are we here? It is the oldest question there is, and it has never once been answered to universal satisfaction. For the Sumerians, this was not an abstract philosophical exercise. It was woven directly into how they understood the structure of the cosmos. The heavens, the earth, the rivers, the cities, and the people who lived in them were not scattered accidents. They were parts of a larger order, an order in which everything, in theory, had a place and a function. Within that order, human beings occupied a genuinely strange position. Not divine, clearly, obviously, mortally not divine. But not simply animal either, something in between. A creature capable of reflection, capable of building, capable of preserving what it learned and passing it to those who came after. A being that could look at the world and ask, why? Rather than simply reacting to it. The first message begins by insisting that this in-between status was not an accident of biology. It was, in the framework this mythology invites us to imagine, a deliberate act of care. I did not make you without purpose. Consider what that line pushes back against. In much of the surviving Mesopotamian material, humanity's origin story is bluntly transactional. The gods were tired. They needed workers. Humans were built to dig canals and carry offerings so that the gods themselves could rest. It is, in its way, one of the most honest creation myths ever recorded. No flattery, no cosmic destiny, just labor and exhaustion, and a practical solution. The first message asks us to sit with a second possibility layered on top of the first, that even a being created for a function might have been given something beyond that function, that the maker, even while building a workforce, might have quietly folded something else into the design, something the original assignment never required and never explained. This is, if you think about it, a very human experience. Most of us were not brought into existence to fulfill some grand cosmic purpose, stated plainly on a piece of paper. We were born, in the most literal biological sense, because that is what living things do. And yet almost everyone, at some point, has felt the unmistakable sense that they are more than the sum of their circumstances, that there is something in them that exceeds what was strictly necessary for survival. Why does a species, whose only evolutionary requirement is to eat, reproduce, and avoid death, also compose symphonies? Why do we build monuments that take longer to complete than a single human lifetime? Why do we send machines to photograph rocks on planets we will never personally visit? None of this is required for survival. Some of it actively works against short-term survival. And yet we do it anyway, relentlessly, in every culture, in every era, without needing anyone to explain why it matters. The first message frames this excess, this refusal to be merely useful, as the whole point, not a side effect of intelligence, the actual signature of intention. I did not make you as something hollow, not a tool with no inner life, not a machine that performs its function and nothing more, something with a center, something with weight. This idea did not begin with the Sumerians, and it certainly did not end with them. The Egyptians spoke of a divine spark carried within every human being, something that connected the individual soul to the larger order of Ma'at, the cosmic balance that governed everything from the flooding of the Nile to the judgment of the dead. Greek philosophers, centuries later, argued fiercely about whether the human mind possessed a portion of the same reason, the same logos, that structured the entire universe, and whether that shared reason was the thing that made a human life meaningful rather than merely biological. Across the Indian subcontinent, philosophical traditions described an inner awareness, distinct from the fluctuating mind and body, that was somehow continuous with the deepest structure of reality itself. These traditions did not copy one another. They arose in different centuries, in different languages, shaped by entirely different environments and political histories, and yet they kept arriving, independently, at some version of the same insight, that human beings carry something that cannot be fully explained by their material circumstances. Call it a spark, a soul, an inner witness, a divine fragment. The vocabulary changes, but the shape of the claim does not. The first message is simply one more voice in that very old chorus, but it adds something the others often leave implicit. It insists that this something more is not just a private, individual possession to be nurtured quietly and kept to oneself. It is connected to a larger project. It is, in the language of the myth, the very thing that separates the human story from a story about a tool that outlived its usefulness. To understand why the Sumerians in particular were so preoccupied with this question, it helps to remember the world they actually lived in. Southern Mesopotamia was not a paradise of endless abundance. It was a harsh, flood-prone, drought-prone floodplain that demanded constant vigilance. The same river that fed a city's grain fields could, in a bad season, drown them entirely. Survival there was not passive. It required exact knowledge: when to plant, how to manage the canals, how to read the sky for warning signs, how to calculate the calendar precisely enough that an entire city's food supply did not depend on guesswork. In an environment like that, knowledge was not a luxury. It was the actual boundary between a city's survival and its disappearance. It is not hard to understand why a civilization shaped by that pressure would come to associate wisdom with almost supernatural authority, and why they would imagine that the god most closely tied to wisdom would also be the god most closely tied to their deepest fears about losing it. And this is where the first message takes its darker turn. Because if knowledge can be given, it can also be lost. Not always through destruction, sometimes simply through forgetting. The slow erosion of understanding that happens when the people who hold it stop passing it along, or when a civilization becomes so focused on the external trappings of success that it quietly loses track of why any of it mattered in the first place. History offers no shortage of examples. Great centers of learning that flourished for a few centuries and then dissolved into rubble, their libraries burned or simply left to rot once no one remained who could read what was written in them. Empires that mastered engineering, law, and administration on a scale that still impresses modern observers, and that nonetheless collapsed, taking enormous stores of practical and philosophical knowledge down with them. Even when the physical monuments survive, a pyramid, a ziggurat, a stretch of ancient road, the knowledge that built them frequently does not. What is left behind is often a mystery to the very descendants of the people who built it. This is why writing mattered so much to the ancient world, and why the first message treats it as something close to sacred. Writing is humanity's oldest, crudest, and still most effective attempt to cheat time. A person dies, a generation disappears entirely, taking its unwritten memories with it. But a symbol pressed into wet clay, once it dries or is fired hard by an accidental fire, can outlast empires. It can lie buried and unread for thousands of years and still, when finally recovered, carry a fragment of a mind that stopped existing millennia earlier. This is precisely what happened with the Sumerians themselves. Their cities crumbled. Their language, once spoken by an enormous, sophisticated civilization, eventually stopped being anyone's native tongue at all, surviving only as a kind of learned, ceremonial language for later scribes, the way Latin persisted in medieval Europe long after Rome fell. Eventually, even that faded. For roughly 2,000 years, no living person on Earth could read a word of Sumerian. And yet the tablets remained, buried under mounds of dirt that archaeologists would later have to identify as the remains of once thriving cities, waiting through the rise and fall of the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Arabs, the Ottomans, waiting through all of it, wordless and patient, until 19th century scholars finally cracked the code of cuneiform and let the dead speak again. This, more than anything else, is the emotional center of the first message. It is not really a story about ancient aliens or hidden bloodlines or secret societies. It is a story about the terrifying fragility of memory and the stubborn, irrational hope that something written down carefully enough might survive long enough to matter to someone the writer will never meet. I made you to remember, the first message insists, and somewhere along the way, you were taught to forget. This is arguably the emotional heart of the entire sequence, and it is worth sitting with slowly. It does not claim that forgetting is accidental. It claims that forgetting was, at some point, actively encouraged, that somewhere between the earliest human communities and the world we live in now, something shifted, and people stopped asking the deepest questions about their own nature and started accepting smaller, more manageable answers instead. You do not need a conspiracy theory to make sense of this. Institutions of every kind, religious, political, economic, have always had practical reasons to prefer citizens who accept a fixed, simple story about who they are and what they are for. A population that constantly interrogates its own purpose is a harder population to organize, tax, or command. This is not a secret. It is one of the oldest and most ordinary dynamics in the history of civilization. Simpler stories are easier to manage than complicated truths, and every society, to some degree, trades a bit of complexity for a bit of order. The first message does not condemn this trade outright. It simply asks us to notice that it happened, and to ask whether something valuable slipped away in the process. The sense, however inconvenient, that human beings might be more than their assigned function. It ends, in the framing offered here, with an image rather than an argument. A figure standing at the edge of the Abzu, the deep, unseen water beneath the world, looking up at a species that has almost entirely forgotten it was ever anything other than useful, and saying, simply, "You were not." Not a servant, not only a servant, a carrier of something else besides. What that something else actually is, what precisely was placed inside the design, and why it might have been suppressed rather than simply forgotten by accident, is where the second message begins. Message 2. The mystery of what was forgotten. If the first message makes a claim, the second message asks the obvious follow-up question. If something was placed within humanity from the beginning, some spark, some capacity, some sense of purpose beyond mere usefulness, then why does it feel, for most people, most of the time, so completely absent? Why does self-forgetting feel like the default condition of being human, rather than the exception? The second message begins here, in the uncomfortable space between what the first message claims and what most people's actual lived experience seems to confirm. Most of us do not walk around with a persistent, vivid sense of cosmic purpose. Most of us are far more familiar with distraction, exhaustion, and the low hum of ordinary anxiety than with any grand feeling of inner significance. If something valuable really was placed within us, where did it go? The ancient Mesopotamians thought about memory very differently than we do today. In the modern world, memory is usually treated as a private, individual function, something that happens inside a single brain, that can be tested, measured, and eventually lost to age or injury. But in much of the ancient world, memory was understood as something far larger than the individual mind. A civilization's memory was carried collectively, through its stories, its rituals, its inherited names for things. To lose that collective memory was not simply inconvenient, it was, in a very real sense, to lose the civilization itself. This is why the fall of a city in the ancient world was rarely described in purely military or economic terms. It was described as a kind of erasure. When Sumerian cities fell, and nearly all of them eventually did, again and again, across centuries of war, drought, and shifting river courses, the losses were not only walls and grain stores. Entire ceremonial calendars stopped being observed. Specific ritual knowledge, held by specific families or temple lineages, simply ended when the last person who knew it died without an apprentice. Skills that had taken generations to refine, particular irrigation techniques suited to a particular stretch of river, particular methods of building suited to a particular kind of clay, could vanish within a single lifetime if the chain of teaching was broken even once. The second message takes this historical reality and turns it inward, applying the same logic to the individual human mind. Just as a civilization can survive physically while losing its deeper cultural memory, a person, or an entire species, can continue to exist, continue to function, continue to build and eat and sleep and reproduce, while losing something more fundamental about who they actually are. This is not a new idea, even outside the world of myth. Nearly every major wisdom tradition on Earth has some version of a forgetting story built into its foundations. The Greeks spoke of the river Lethe, whose waters caused the souls of the dead to forget their previous lives before being born again. The biblical tradition describes an original garden, an original closeness to the divine that was lost through a single choice, a break that subsequent generations would spend the rest of history trying to understand and, in various ways, trying to repair. Vedic and later Hindu traditions describe long cycles of ages, each one further from an original state of clarity, with the present age often described as the darkest and most confused of the cycle. Buddhist traditions, in a different register, describe an almost universal human condition of ignorance, not stupidity, but a basic misunderstanding of the nature of one's own mind, that has to be actively, deliberately undone through practice, rather than simply accepted as permanent. None of these traditions developed in contact with one another during their earliest formative periods, and yet each one, independently, arrived at some version of the same basic structure, a before, in which something was clearer or closer or truer, and an after, defined by distance, confusion, or loss. The second message situates itself inside this very old and very widespread pattern, and asks the same question all of these traditions eventually ask. If forgetting is this universal, is it really an accident? Or is there something built into the process of becoming a settled, organized, surviving civilization that requires a certain amount of forgetting in order to function? Here the myth offers an idea worth taking seriously, even outside its mythological wrapping. The suggestion is that the forgetting was never meant to be permanent, that whatever was placed within humanity in the beginning was designed with a kind of built-in delay, not erased, but veiled, protected, held back until a later point when it could be integrated safely. Why would anyone design it that way? The second message offers an answer that is, at its core, a statement about readiness. A species newly formed, newly organized into fragile city-states, still learning the basics of agriculture and cooperation and law, might genuinely not have been prepared to carry the full weight of unmediated self-knowledge. Direct, unfiltered access to one's own depths. The kind of raw self-confrontation that mystics across every tradition describe as simultaneously the most valuable and the most destabilizing experience a person can have, is not something every stage of development can absorb safely. There is a very ordinary, non-mystical version of this same principle that shows up constantly in human development. A small child is not handed the unfiltered truth about every difficult subject in the world the moment they are old enough to ask a question about it. Not because the truth is bad, but because comprehension has to be built in stages. Give someone information before the internal structure exists to hold it, and the information does not enlighten. It overwhelms, or it gets distorted into something smaller and less useful than the truth actually was. The second message frames the long, slow, often painful arc of human history, the endless cycles of building and collapse, war and peace, insight and superstition, as this same developmental process playing out on a civilizational scale. Not because some external force is deliberately withholding truth out of cruelty, but because a species, like a person, has to grow into the capacity to hold certain kinds of understanding. This reframes the idea of forgetting in an important way. It is not simply loss. It is, potentially, protection, a kind of scaffolding that holds a fragile structure in place while it is still being built, with the explicit understanding that the scaffolding is meant to come down eventually, once the structure underneath it can stand on its own. And if that is true, then the second message's central image, water again, always water in this mythology, becomes newly meaningful. The barrier between what is known and what is forgotten is imagined here not as a wall, permanent and immovable, but as something closer to a dam, built deliberately, holding something back deliberately, and designed from the very beginning with the expectation that it would eventually be opened. This is, admittedly, a comforting idea, and comforting ideas deserve scrutiny rather than automatic acceptance. It would be easy to use this framework as an excuse, to treat every unresolved question about human nature as something that is simply not time yet, rather than doing the difficult work of investigation. That would be a misuse of the message, not an application of it. What the second message actually seems to be pointing toward is something more modest, and in some ways more useful. Not a promise that answers will simply arrive on schedule, an invitation to pay attention. Because if the forgetting really was designed to be temporary, then the dissolving of that barrier, however it happens, whenever it happens, is not going to look like a sudden thunderclap of universal revelation. It is going to look like exactly what actual human history has always looked like: forgotten cities being unearthed, forgotten languages being deciphered, old questions, dismissed for generations as childish or unanswerable, being asked again with new seriousness by people who refuse to accept the smaller story they were handed. This, in fact, is precisely what happened with the Sumerians themselves, and it is worth pausing on the historical reality here, because it is genuinely remarkable and does not require any embellishment to be moving. For roughly 2,000 years, the civilization that gave the world its first writing system, its first law codes, its first cities, and some of its oldest surviving literature was almost completely unknown. Not obscure, unknown. Nobody in the medieval or early modern world had any real conception that Sumer had existed at all. Then, in the middle of the 19th century, archaeologists began excavating mounds in what is now Iraq and pulling thousands of clay tablets out of the ruins of ancient palace and temple libraries. For decades, nobody could read a word of what was written on them. The script itself, cuneiform, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay, had to be painstakingly decoded, syllable by syllable, using comparative techniques borrowed from the earlier, equally difficult decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs. And then, slowly, the tablets began to speak, not administrative records only, though there were plenty of those, myths, prayers, law codes, proverbs, love poetry, business contracts, school exercises, written by bored apprentice scribes making the same mistakes children make in classrooms today. An entire civilization, silent for 2 millennia, suddenly audible again, not through any supernatural mechanism, but through the unglamorous, decades-long labor of philologists working line by line through fragments of broken clay. If there is a genuine miracle buried anywhere in this story, it is not a hidden extraterrestrial signal. It is this, that patient human curiosity, applied consistently over generations, really can recover what looked permanently lost. The second message does not need a supernatural mechanism to make its point, because the point has already been demonstrated, in full historical detail, by the actual archaeological record. Forgetting, even prolonged, catastrophic forgetting, is not always final. The second message closes on a question rather than an answer, because the whole structure of this sequence depends on that question staying open a little longer. If something was forgotten, what survived the forgetting? If knowledge can be buried and later recovered, where exactly was it kept safe in the meantime? The answer, according to the mythic tradition this sequence draws from, arrives through water, through catastrophe, through the flood, and it is to that story, the oldest and most widely shared catastrophe narrative in human history, that the third message now turns. Message 3. The Flood, as instruction. Very few stories have traveled as far or lasted as long as the story of a great flood. Across continents that had no contact with one another for most of recorded history, across languages with no shared root, human cultures preserved strikingly similar accounts of a catastrophic deluge. A world before, a warning, a vessel, a handful of survivors, a world after, rebuilt from almost nothing. In Mesopotamia, this story appears first in the Atrahasis epic, and later, in a related form, within the Epic of Gilgamesh, centuries before anything resembling the biblical account of Noah was ever written down. Scholars have debated for well over a century what to make of these similarities. Some see clear evidence of direct textual borrowing, one tradition drawing on an earlier one as it passed through the region. Others see something closer to independent cultural memory, separate societies, in different times and places, each preserving their own version of some genuinely catastrophic regional or even global event from the deep past. The debate continues, and reasonable scholars land in different places on it. What is not really in dispute is the sheer persistence of the pattern. Whatever its ultimate origin, the flood story is one of the oldest and most widely shared narratives human beings have ever told about themselves. The third message asks us to look again at what that story might actually mean, not as a record of divine punishment, though every surviving version certainly includes an element of judgment, but as something closer to an instruction wrapped inside a catastrophe. To understand why this reframing matters, it helps to remember how radically different the ancient relationship to natural disaster was compared to the modern one. Today, we tend to separate the physical event from its meaning. A flood is a hydrological phenomenon, explainable through rainfall patterns, river dynamics, and geology. It is tragic, but it is not, in the modern secular imagination, generally understood as a message. The ancient world rarely made that separation. Nature and meaning were entangled. A flood was not simply water rising. It was an event that had to be interpreted, because in that world view, nothing catastrophic happened without significance. The question was never only, how did this happen? It was always also, what does this mean? And what is it asking of us? Understood this way, the flood tradition becomes less a story about a punished species and more a story about a fragile species being forced, brutally, to decide what actually mattered enough to save. This is the deeper logic beneath the third message's central claim, that survival, in this myth, was never only about keeping a handful of human bodies alive. It was about what those bodies carried forward once the water receded. A civilization is not simply its buildings and its population count. It is, in a much more durable sense, its accumulated knowledge, its farming techniques, its social structures, its stories, its sense of what it means to live well. Lose the population but somehow preserve the knowledge, and something essential survives. Save the population but lose everything they knew, and in a meaningful sense the civilization has still died, only its biology continues. This is why, in the Mesopotamian telling, Enki's role in the flood story is so specific and so consistent across every surviving version. He does not stop the catastrophe. He cannot. That decision belongs to a higher authority within the divine hierarchy the myths describe. What he does instead is warn one person, and equip that person not just to survive, but to carry something forward. The instructions given to the flood's survivor, across the various tellings, are oddly specific for what is ostensibly a simple survival story. Precise measurements for the vessel, specific cargo requirements, not just food, but breeding pairs of animals, seeds, and, in some versions, skilled craftsmen, brought aboard specifically to ensure that certain trades would not be lost. This is not merely a story about escaping drowning. It reads, if you sit with it carefully, like an emergency plan for civilizational continuity, a deliberate, structured attempt to compress an entire world's worth of necessary knowledge into the smallest survivable package. The third message asks us to take this detail seriously, not as literal engineering instruction, but as a statement of values. What did the ancient world consider worth saving, when only a handful of things could be saved? Not gold, not weapons, livestock, seed, skill, the raw material of a future, rather than the trophies of a past. This is where the third message's real weight lands, not in speculation about the mechanics of the flood itself, but in the question it leaves any listener holding afterward. If your own world were ending tomorrow, and you could only carry forward a small, carefully chosen cargo of knowledge, skill, and memory, what would you choose? What, out of everything humanity has learned across 10,000 years of trial and error, actually deserves to survive the next catastrophe, whatever form it eventually takes? Every generation, it turns out, faces its own version of this question, even without a literal flood. Wars end libraries. Economic collapse ends apprenticeships. Environmental change threatens to end entire ways of life that took centuries to develop, from small-scale fishing traditions to particular methods of dryland farming adapted over generations to a specific patch of earth. The threats change shape from era to era. The underlying challenge, deciding, under pressure, what is actually worth protecting, does not. There is a second, subtler layer to the third message, one that concerns not just what survives a catastrophe, but how it survives. Specifically, the ancient practice of encoding meaning inside forms that could travel further and last longer than a plain explanation ever could. Ancient cultures were remarkably comfortable with layered meaning. A story could function as simple entertainment for a general audience, while carrying a second, more demanding layer of instruction for those prepared to look for it. A monument could serve an obvious practical function: a granary, a defensive wall, a boundary marker, while also encoding, in its proportions or its orientation, ideas about cosmic order that its builders considered too important to leave unrecorded, even if most people who walked past it every day never thought twice about why it was built exactly the way it was. This does not mean every ancient structure hides a secret code, and the third message is not making that claim. It is making a more modest observation that ancient people understood something modern culture sometimes forgets: that a simple, memorable story can outlive a complicated explanation by thousands of years. An idea wrapped in narrative travels. An idea presented as a dry technical manual usually does not. The flood story, in this light, becomes a masterclass in that principle. Strip away every mythological detail, and what remains is an extraordinarily durable packet of practical wisdom, compressed into a form so memorable that it has now survived in dozens of independent cultural variations for what may be thousands of years. Build ahead of the disaster. Preserve breeding stock and seed, not just food for the immediate moment. Bring skilled people, not just supplies. Expect the world after to be different from the world before, and prepare accordingly rather than assuming a simple return to normal. None of this requires supernatural intervention to be true, or to be worth taking seriously. It requires only that we notice how much practical, hard-won wisdom ancient cultures were capable of encoding into forms built to last, and ask what we, in turn, are doing to ensure that our own hardest-won lessons survive the next disruption, whatever it turns out to be. The third message closes with an image that ties directly into the message that follows it. After the water recedes, after the vessel opens and its cargo steps back out onto dry, unfamiliar ground, the survivors face an entirely new question. It is no longer a question of what to save, it becomes a question of what to build next. Not just physically, on the ruined landscape in front of them, but internally, in the part of themselves that has to make sense of having survived something that erased almost everyone and everything they knew. That is where the fourth message begins. Message 4. Build. Build. It is one of the shortest instructions in the entire sequence, and one of the most misleading if taken only at face value. Every civilization that has ever existed has left behind some physical evidence of its building. Cities, temples, roads, tombs, walls raised against enemies both real and imagined. Human beings are, among many other things, a species defined by construction. We do not simply inhabit our environment the way most other animals do. We reshape it, relentlessly, according to whatever vision of order we happen to be carrying at the time. The fourth message begins with this same word, build, but almost immediately redirects its meaning. The most important structure a person or a civilization ever builds, it insists, is not made of stone. This idea would not have seemed strange to the people who first told these stories. The ancient world rarely drew the sharp line modern secular culture draws between the external world and the internal one. The universe above was thought to be mirrored, in some fundamental way, by the world below, and the human being, standing at the intersection of the two, was often understood as a smaller version of the same cosmic order that governed the movement of the stars. This is part of why ancient temples were never simply buildings in the purely functional, modern sense. They were treated as models, deliberate, small-scale reproductions of a believed cosmic order, their measurements and orientations chosen not arbitrarily, but according to ideas about balance, alignment, and harmony that the builders considered essential to the temple actually functioning as intended. A temple built carelessly, in this worldview, was not just aesthetically disappointing, it was, in some sense, structurally false, a lie told in stone about the true shape of the universe. The fourth message asks a related question about the individual human being. If knowledge has been recovered, remembered, however partially, after generations of forgetting, what should be done with it? The answer offered here is deliberately unglamorous. Not immediate action in the world, but internal construction first. A foundation, an internal architecture, capable of holding what has been recovered without distorting it. This matters because knowledge, on its own, is inert. A person can memorize an enormous amount of information and still act, in every meaningful sense, unwisely. A civilization can develop extraordinary technical capability and still direct that capability toward its own destruction. Facts do not automatically produce good judgment. Information does not automatically produce wisdom. Something has to happen in between, an internal process of organizing, weighing, and integrating, before raw knowledge becomes something a person can actually be trusted to act on. The fourth message calls this internal process the House of Knowing, and describes it fittingly, in architectural language, even while insisting that its true site of construction is inside a person rather than outside them. This metaphor, the self as a building under construction, recurs across an enormous range of human traditions, arrived at independently by cultures with no meaningful contact with one another. Contemplative traditions across the world describe stages of inner development using architectural or spatial language, gates to be passed through, levels to be climbed, chambers to be entered in a particular, non-negotiable order. None of these traditions are identical to one another, and it would be a mistake to flatten their real differences into a single generic, ancient wisdom. But the shared instinct toward architectural metaphor, the sense that inner development has stages, structure, and a kind of engineering logic to it, is itself worth noticing. Something about the human mind seems to want to describe its own growth in the language of construction. Foundations first, walls next, a roof only once the walls can actually bear its weight. The fourth message describes this internal construction in three loosely sequential phases, though it is careful to note that in a real human life, these phases rarely proceed as neatly as any diagram suggests. The first phase is recognition, simply acknowledging that something worth building actually exists, that the earlier message's claims about purpose and forgotten depth are not merely comforting stories to be nodded at and set aside, but an actual invitation to pay closer attention to one's own inner life. Recognition sounds passive, but it rarely is. Most people spend a significant portion of their lives moving quickly enough and staying busy enough that recognition never really has room to happen. Slowing down enough to notice what is actually going on inside oneself is, for many people, already a meaningful act of construction. The second phase is orientation, choosing, deliberately, what the internal structure is going to face. A building without a clear orientation is just an enclosed space. It does not organize experience, it merely contains it. Orientation, in this framework, does not mean withdrawing from the ordinary demands of daily life. It means choosing, consciously, what those demands are going to be measured against. A person oriented only toward external validation, status, comparison, the shifting approval of others, builds a very different internal structure than a person oriented towards something steadier, their own honestly examined values, their sense of what actually matters to them, independent of who is watching. The third phase, activation, is the hardest to describe and the hardest to force. It is not something that can simply be willed into existence through effort alone. It tends to arrive through encounter with difficult truths a person can no longer avoid, with other people who are doing similar internal work and can recognize it in one another, with experiences intense enough to break through the ordinary noise of daily distraction and demand real attention. The fourth message is careful not to promise that activation happens on schedule, or that it happens the same way for everyone. What it does insist on is that the first two phases, recognition and orientation, make activation possible, even if they cannot guarantee it or control its timing. There is a claim embedded in the fourth message that deserves particular attention, because it extends this architecture of self-metaphor outward into the physical world, and because it connects to something genuinely observable in the historical record, even without any need for exotic explanation. Across cultures with no significant contact with one another, ancient builders repeatedly aligned major monuments with extraordinary astronomical precision, toward solstice sunrises, toward specific stars, toward the cardinal directions, with an accuracy that still impresses modern surveyors working with far more sophisticated instruments. This is a well-documented, uncontested fact of the archaeological record, not a speculative claim. The fourth message offers one possible way of understanding why ancient builders cared so much about this kind of precision. If a temple or a monument was understood as a physical expression of an internal order that had already been carefully built and calibrated within its designers, then astronomical alignment was not a decorative flourish. It was a form of honesty, an insistence that the external structure actually reflect the same careful order the builders believed governed the universe as a whole, rather than settling for something merely convenient or approximate. This is, admittedly, an interpretive claim rather than a provable one, and it should be treated that way. We cannot climb inside the minds of builders who lived thousands of years ago and confirm exactly what they believed they were doing when they aligned a particular wall toward a particular star. But it is a coherent, respectful way of taking their evident care seriously, rather than dismissing it as superstition or coincidence. People who go to extraordinary lengths to get something exactly right are usually trying to honor something they consider important. The fourth message simply asks us to extend that same basic charity toward the builders of the ancient world that we would extend to any careful craftsperson today. The fourth message closes with an instruction that folds directly into the message that follows it, and that deserves to be quoted here in full, because it is the hinge on which the entire second half of this sequence turns. Build first inside. What you build inside will show you what to build outside, and what you build outside will teach the ones who come after what to build inside. This is not a claim about architecture at all, not really. It is a claim about legacy, about the way internal clarity, once it exists, naturally seeks external expression, and about the way that external expression, in turn, becomes a teaching tool for people who were not there for the original internal work, but can still, generations later, encounter its physical trace and be moved to ask the same questions that produced it in the first place. Before this teaching can happen, though, there is a prior question the fourth message leaves conspicuously unanswered. It tells you to build. It does not yet tell you, in any detail, what exactly you are building with. That question, the question of what a human being actually carries within them, what raw material this inner construction project is even made of, is where the fifth message begins. Message 5. What do you carry within you? The question that opens the fifth message is not about anything humanity has built. It is not about cities, monuments, or the careful astronomical alignment of ancient walls. It is a question turned directly and uncomfortably inward. Do you know what you carry? For most of recorded history, humanity has searched for its answers by looking outward. We have crossed oceans that once seemed uncrossable. We have climbed the highest points on every continent. We have sent instruments deeper into the structure of matter than the unaided eye could ever perceive, and sent other instruments outward, past the edge of our own solar system, into interstellar space. And through all of that outward searching, one mystery has remained stubbornly, almost comically unresolved: the mystery of the searcher itself. What is consciousness, actually? Not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a lived, immediate fact. Why does a being that could, in principle, get by on pure instinct, instead spend enormous amounts of energy imagining things that do not yet exist, telling stories, composing music no survival requirement demands, building philosophies that offer no practical advantage in a fight or a harvest? Why does a species whose only strict biological mandate is to eat, reproduce, and avoid death also spend an enormous portion of its collective energy asking what any of that is actually for? These are the questions separating a human life from mere existence. A human being does not simply experience the world the way, as far as we can tell, most other creatures do. A human being attempts to understand it, and, more strangely still, attempts to understand its own attempts at understanding, layering reflection on top of reflection almost indefinitely. The fifth message treats this capacity not as an incidental byproduct of a large brain, but as the central inheritance the earlier messages have been building toward. Something was placed within humanity. The sequence has insisted from its opening line. The fifth message finally asks what, exactly, that something actually is. Ancient traditions across the world converge, again and again, on the same basic intuition: that human beings contain something that cannot be fully accounted for by physical description alone. Not something that can be weighed, measured, or located under a microscope. Something recognized instead through its effects, through creativity, through moral reasoning, through the unmistakable, if hard to define, experience of being aware that one is aware. The Sumerians themselves described humanity as a hybrid creation, made from the clay of the earth, but mixed, in the mythic account, with something of divine origin as well. Egyptian tradition described multiple interacting aspects of the self, only some of which were tied directly to the physical body. Greek philosophy spent centuries debating the exact relationship between body and soul, never fully resolving it, but never abandoning the underlying conviction that some meaningful distinction between the two actually existed. Traditions across the Indian subcontinent developed extraordinarily detailed frameworks for describing layers of consciousness, distinguishing between the ordinary, fluctuating mind and something steadier and more fundamental beneath it. Different vocabularies, different metaphysical commitments, but the same underlying question, asked with remarkable consistency across cultures that could not have simply copied the idea from one another. Is there something within a human being that exceeds ordinary biological explanation? The fifth message does not claim to resolve this question in any final, provable sense. No myth honestly can. What it does is reframe the search itself. The greatest discovery available to a human being, it suggests, is not a new continent or a new particle. It is the self, examined honestly and without the comforting distortions people usually apply to their own self-understanding. This is, in its own way, one of the oldest pieces of advice in recorded human history. The instruction to know yourself appears in one form or another across an enormous range of ancient wisdom traditions, often treated as the essential prerequisite for any other kind of genuine understanding. The reasoning behind this instruction is worth taking seriously on its own terms, independent of any mythological framing. If a person's perception of the world is inevitably filtered through their own unexamined assumptions, fears, and blind spots, then any attempt to understand the world honestly has to begin with an honest accounting of those filters. You cannot fully trust an instrument you have never calibrated. And in this framework, the human mind is the instrument through which every other observation about the universe necessarily passes. The fifth message pushes this idea one step further, into territory that is genuinely challenging and worth sitting with rather than rushing past. It suggests that what a person inherits is not only cultural, language, story, accumulated technical knowledge passed down through education and tradition, but also something more fundamental, a basic biological and psychological capacity for learning, adapting, creating, and transforming that exceeds anything strictly required by evolutionary pressure alone. This is not a claim requiring any exotic explanation. It is, in fact, one of the genuinely strange and well-documented facts of human evolutionary history. The earliest humans did not inherit cities. They built them, from nothing, using nothing but observation, trial, error, and an extraordinary, still not fully explained capacity for cumulative cultural learning that appears to be unique, at least in its scale and complexity, among Earth species. They did not inherit written language. They invented it, independently, in at least a handful of separate locations around the world, using nothing but raw ingenuity applied to a genuinely difficult problem. They did not inherit the accumulated scientific understanding of the physical universe. They built it, slowly, generation by painstaking generation, through centuries of careful observation, argument, and correction. The human story, told honestly, is a story of potential becoming reality, through sustained effort, not a story of anything simply handed down complete. But the fifth message insists, and this is its real center of gravity, that potential alone is never enough. Capacity without direction is not automatically a gift. It can just as easily become a danger. A person can possess enormous talent and simply never use it, letting it atrophy through neglect or fear. A civilization can accumulate extraordinary technical knowledge and apply it recklessly, without the wisdom to anticipate its consequences. A powerful mind, left entirely undisciplined, does not default toward benevolence. It is just as capable of building something destructive as something beautiful, and the raw capacity itself offers no guarantee about which direction it will ultimately take. This is why ancient traditions so consistently paired the discovery of knowledge with an accompanying warning about responsibility. The more a person or a civilization understands, the greater the consequences of using that understanding carelessly. A child who discovers fire has to learn, quickly and sometimes painfully, how to control it before it controls them. A civilization that discovers a powerful new technology has to develop, at more or less the same pace, the ethical maturity to use it wisely. And history offers no shortage of examples of technological capability racing far ahead of the wisdom needed to handle it safely. This is the deeper meaning buried inside the fifth message's opening question. Do you know what you carry is not really asking whether a person possesses some hidden talent or capacity. Most people, if they are honest with themselves, already sense that they do, even if they cannot always name it precisely. The real question is whether a person understands the weight that comes attached to that capacity, the responsibility that inevitably follows any genuine increase in understanding, whether personal or collective. Look at the arc of human history through this lens, and a clear, recurring pattern emerges. The discovery of agriculture changed human society permanently, for better and for worse, reshaping everything from diet to social hierarchy to the very concept of property. The invention of writing changed how knowledge moved between generations, making certain kinds of cumulative progress possible that had never been possible before, while also enabling new forms of bureaucratic control that had not existed when all knowledge lived only in fallible human memory. The scientific revolution transformed humanity's relationship with the natural world, unlocking astonishing capabilities alongside genuinely new and unprecedented risks. The digital revolution, still unfolding in real time as these words are spoken, has connected the entire species in ways no earlier generation could have imagined, while simultaneously creating entirely new vulnerabilities that no earlier generation had to reckon with either. Each of these transformations expanded what humanity was capable of. None of them, on their own, guaranteed that the expanded capability would be used wisely. That gap between what we are capable of doing and what we have the wisdom to know we should do is, in the fifth message's framing, the central unresolved tension of the entire human project, as true today as it has ever been. And this brings the fifth message back, in its closing lines, to the same insistence that closed the message before it. The house of knowing, described in the fourth message, is not decoration. It is not an optional spiritual accessory for people with the leisure time to pursue it. It is the necessary container for whatever capacity a person actually carries, the structure that determines whether that capacity gets expressed as wisdom or squandered as recklessness. You are the foundation, the fifth message says, addressing not a chosen few, but anyone willing to actually listen, of whatever you eventually build. If you are careless with yourself, what you build will be unstable, no matter how impressive it looks from the outside. If you take the trouble to become wise, what you build has a chance of lasting. Look outward all you like, the fifth message concludes. Search the ruins of forgotten cities, study the light of distant stars, chase down every external mystery that catches your attention. None of that searching will be wasted. But do not let it substitute for the harder, less glamorous work of turning that same searching, honest attention inward, because the deepest and most consequential mystery any person will ever actually investigate is not hidden beneath the earth or scattered across the night sky. It is carried, quietly, inside the very mind doing the searching. And if that capacity is real, if something genuinely valuable really is carried within every human being, waiting to be recognized rather than manufactured from nothing, then a further question follows naturally. When, if ever, does that capacity actually begin to stir? Is there a pattern to it? A rhythm? Something closer to a season than a random, unpredictable event? The sixth message turns to exactly this question, the strange, recurring human intuition that history itself might move in cycles, and that those cycles might carry meaning of their own. Message 6. The turning of cycles. If humanity carries something within it waiting to be recognized, when does that recognition actually happen? Is there a pattern to it, or is it simply random, a private accident occurring, unpredictably, one individual mind at a time, with no larger shape connecting one person's awakening to another's? The sixth message approaches this question through one of the oldest intellectual habits of the ancient world, the conviction that time itself is not a straight line, but a cycle. Modern industrial culture tends to imagine history as linear, a story with a clear beginning, a long middle defined by more or less continuous progress, and an open, unwritten future stretching indefinitely ahead. This is such a deeply embedded assumption in contemporary thought that it can be difficult to remember. It is not the only way human beings have ever understood time. Many ancient cultures, the Sumerians included, thought about time very differently. They tracked the visible motion of the stars with remarkable precision and noticed, correctly, that certain celestial patterns repeat over very long spans. The slow wobble of the Earth's axis, for instance, which causes the position of the stars behind the Sun at a given time of year to shift gradually over a cycle lasting roughly 26,000 years, a phenomenon modern astronomers call the precession of the equinoxes, and that ancient skywatchers, without any of our modern instruments, had already noticed and begun tracking through nothing more than generations of careful, patient observation. From patterns like this, many ancient cultures developed frameworks in which history itself was understood as cyclical rather than strictly linear, moving through recurring ages, each with its own character, each eventually giving way to the next, in a rhythm too vast to be visible within a single human lifetime, but detectable across the accumulated observations of many generations working together. The sixth message borrows this ancient framework and applies it to the specific question the previous message left open. If human self-understanding really does move through periods of clarity and periods of obscurity, echoing the same rhythm of forgetting and recovery the second message already described, then perhaps that rhythm follows a discernible pattern, rather than occurring purely at random. This idea should be approached carefully because it sits right at the boundary between legitimate historical observation and something closer to numerology, and it is worth being honest about exactly where that boundary lies. It is true, as a matter of documented history, that human civilizations do move through recognizable periods of expansion and contraction, eras of relative peace and accumulated learning, followed by eras of upheaval, war, or collapse that can set entire regions back for generations, followed eventually by renewed periods of stability and rebuilding. This pattern is real, well documented, and does not require any mystical explanation. It follows fairly directly from the ordinary interplay of resource availability, political stability, climate variation, and simple demographic momentum. What the sixth message adds to this observable historical pattern is a more speculative claim that periods of particular upheaval or transition tend to coincide with periods of unusually widespread questioning, moments when large numbers of people, more or less simultaneously and independently, start asking the same fundamental questions about identity, meaning, and purpose that individuals have always asked privately, but that do not usually reach this kind of collective intensity all at once. Whether or not this claim holds up to rigorous historical scrutiny, it does describe something that recognizably happens. There are periods in recorded history when philosophical and spiritual questioning seems to intensify across multiple, unconnected civilizations at roughly the same time, for reasons that remain genuinely debated among historians. There are other periods defined more by consolidation, orthodoxy, and a general cultural reluctance to question inherited assumptions. Neither pattern lasts forever. Eventually, one gives way to the other, and then, eventually, back again. The sixth message frames the recurring transition between these two states, periods of settled orthodoxy and periods of active, widespread questioning, as a kind of great turning, and suggests, cautiously, that any given human life is always positioned somewhere within this larger, slower rhythm, whether or not the person living it happens to notice. It is worth being direct here about what this message is not claiming, because myths of this kind are easy to misuse. It is not offering a precise calendar date on which some cosmic transformation is guaranteed to occur. It is not promising that a specific generation is uniquely chosen or uniquely burdened in a way that no other generation in history has ever been. Every generation in recorded history has had people who were convinced they were living through history's most decisive turning point, and most of those people, in hindsight, were simply responding to the ordinary, universal experience of living through change while it is actually happening, which always feels more chaotic and unprecedented from the inside than it will look from the outside, decades or centuries later. What the sixth message offers instead is something more modest and, arguably, more genuinely useful, an invitation to notice the specific conditions that tend to accompany periods of widespread questioning, whenever and wherever they occur, rather than a prediction about exactly when the next one will arrive. Several such conditions recur across history with enough consistency to be worth naming plainly, without any need for mystical embellishment. Increased contact between previously isolated groups of people tends to accelerate questioning, because encountering a genuinely different way of organizing a society, a genuinely different set of assumptions about how the world works, makes it much harder to treat one's own inherited assumptions as simply self-evident and beyond question. Periods of technological change tend to have a similar effect, because new tools regularly reveal previously hidden aspects of the world and force existing frameworks of understanding to stretch, adapt, or in some cases, break entirely under the pressure of information that simply did not fit the old picture. Periods of institutional strain, when the existing structures meant to explain the world to people, whether religious, political, or scientific, begin visibly failing to answer the questions people are actually asking, tend to open space for alternative explanations to be seriously considered, often for the first time in generations. And periods of increased communication, in which ideas can travel further, faster, and to more people than was previously possible, tend to accelerate all of the above simultaneously, compressing what might once have taken a very long time to unfold into a comparatively short and often disorienting span. None of these conditions require any mystical explanation to notice, and the sixth message does not ask for one. What it asks, instead, is that we notice how many of these conditions have historically clustered together during periods people later came to recognize, in hindsight, as genuine turning points, and that we hold open the possibility, without forcing any particular conclusion, that we might be living through, or approaching, a period with a similar shape. This is, deliberately, left as an open question rather than a settled prediction, because the honest and useful version of this message is not a countdown clock. It is a way of paying closer attention to the present moment, noticing when the ordinary rhythms of questioning and consolidation seem to be shifting, without needing to resolve, with false certainty, exactly what that shift will ultimately mean. There is a personal, inward dimension to this cyclical framework as well, distinct from its application to entire civilizations, and it may in the end be the more durable and more genuinely useful part of the message. Individual human beings, quite apart from whatever larger historical pattern they happen to be living inside, also move through their own private cycles of questioning and consolidation, periods of settled certainty, in which the basic framework a person uses to understand their own life feels solid and mostly unquestioned, and periods of active, sometimes uncomfortable searching, in which old certainties no longer feel adequate and something new has to be worked out, often through real difficulty, before a new, more accurate kind of stability can be found. Neither state, the sixth message insists, should be treated as a permanent failure or a permanent achievement. Certainty is not wisdom simply because it feels stable. Questioning is not confusion simply because it feels uncomfortable. Both are stages in an ongoing, lifelong rhythm, and recognizing which stage a person is currently in, rather than fighting against it or being ashamed of it, is itself a meaningful form of the self-knowledge the fifth message already described. The sixth message closes with an instruction that is deliberately, almost disarmingly simple, especially given how much conceptual ground the preceding messages have covered. When you notice yourself questioning again, after a long period of certainty, do not assume something has gone wrong. Look around you. Others are very likely questioning at the same time, even if you cannot yet see them. This simple observation, that periods of genuine searching tend to arrive in clusters, connecting people across otherwise unrelated lives who happen to be moving through a similar season at a similar time, leads directly into the message that follows. Because if searching does tend to cluster in this way, drawing people together who are each independently working through the same difficult questions, an urgent and practical follow-up question arises almost immediately. Not everyone offering answers during a period of widespread searching is offering good ones. How, exactly, is a person supposed to tell the difference? Message 7. Telling the genuine from the false. Periods of searching are also, reliably, periods of exploitation. This is one of the oldest and least comfortable patterns in the entire history of human belief, and the seventh message addresses it directly rather than pretending it does not exist. Whenever large numbers of people find themselves questioning inherited certainties and searching for something more genuine, someone else is usually waiting nearby, ready to offer an answer, not necessarily out of any evil intent, but often out of ordinary human confusion, sincere but mistaken conviction, or in some cases, more troublingly, out of a calculated understanding of exactly how profitable uncertainty can be for whoever manages to resolve it, or appear to resolve it. The seventh message opens with an observation that deserves to be taken seriously, well beyond its mythological framing. Not everything that presents itself with the appearance of deep wisdom actually deserves that appearance. This is a genuinely difficult problem, and it has been a difficult problem for as long as human beings have organized themselves into religious and philosophical communities. How is an honest but uncertain person, genuinely searching for real understanding, supposed to distinguish a teacher worth listening to from one who is not, especially when both may use remarkably similar language, cite remarkably similar traditions, and offer remarkably similar promises of clarity and belonging? The seventh message does not offer a simple checklist, because no honest framework for this kind of discernment can offer one. What it offers instead is a small number of underlying questions, meant to be applied patiently and repeatedly to any teaching, tradition, or authority a searching person encounters, including, explicitly, this very sequence of messages itself. The first question concerns capacity. Does this teaching, this framework, this authority tend to increase a person's own capacity to think clearly and act with integrity? Or does it tend to decrease it, quietly making the person more dependent on the teacher, the institution, or the specific interpreter for even basic decisions they were previously capable of making on their own? Genuine wisdom, across nearly every tradition worth taking seriously, tends to move a person toward greater self-sufficiency and clearer independent judgment over time, even while that same wisdom might, along the way, ask for real discipline, real humility, and real effort. False or exploitative teaching tends to move in the opposite direction, creating an ever-growing dependency, in which the follower's own judgment is treated as inherently unreliable, and the teacher's judgment, or the institution's official interpretation, becomes the only trustworthy source of truth remaining. This is a distinction worth sitting with, because both genuine growth and unhealthy dependency can, in their early stages, feel remarkably similar from the inside. Both often begin with a period of intense, humbling relief at finally having found an answer that seems to fit. The second question concerns fear. Does this teaching rely, centrally and repeatedly, on fear to sustain the follower's engagement? Fear of an approaching catastrophe, fear of expulsion from a chosen or protected group, fear of some terrible consequence that will befall anyone who leaves, questions too closely, or simply loses interest. Fear is not, by itself, always a disqualifying sign. Healthy caution about real dangers is simply realistic, and some traditions do include sober warnings about genuine risks. But when fear becomes the primary engine holding a person's engagement in place, when the teaching seems to require a constant, low-level anxiety in order to keep functioning, rather than relying primarily on the teaching's own coherence, evidence, and lived value, that is worth noticing carefully and treating as a serious warning sign rather than an incidental feature. The third question concerns transparency. Can this teaching withstand serious, good faith scrutiny from someone genuinely trying to understand it, or does it depend on remaining at least partially obscured, accessible only to insiders, expressible only in specialized vocabulary that resists translation into plain language, protected by an implicit or explicit suggestion that questioning too closely is itself a kind of failure or betrayal? Genuine understanding, in the framework the seventh message offers, does not typically fear plain language or honest scrutiny. It does not need to hide behind complexity in order to seem impressive, and it does not treat basic, reasonable questions as evidence of a questioner's inadequacy. The seventh message applies these same three questions, quite deliberately, to a subject that runs directly through the earlier parts of this very sequence: the long, recurring human tradition of apocalyptic thinking, the conviction, appearing again and again across widely different cultures and eras, that the current age is uniquely doomed, and that catastrophe is close at hand. It would be easy, at this point in the sequence, to treat the sixth message's discussion of cyclical turning points as an invitation toward exactly this kind of apocalyptic thinking, and the seventh message exists, in part, specifically to guard against that misreading. A genuine turning point in human understanding, it insists, is not the same thing as an ending. Every culture that has ever lived through a period of major transformation has, understandably, been tempted to interpret that transformation as the end of the world, because from the perspective of anyone actually living through it, transformation this large genuinely does feel like an ending. The end of a way of life, the end of certainties that once felt permanent, the end of an old, familiar shape to things. But feeling like an ending, and actually being one, are not the same thing, and history's own record bears this out with remarkable consistency. Nearly every generation that has believed itself to be living at the absolute close of history has, in fact, simply been living through one more transition among many, difficult, disorienting, sometimes genuinely tragic, but not final. The seventh message asks its listener to hold this historical pattern in mind whenever encountering apocalyptic claims of any kind, including the ones embedded, at times, within mythology itself. This same discernment applies with equal force to claims of hidden, exclusive knowledge, the recurring promise, found across an enormous range of traditions and movements throughout history, that some small group alone possesses a secret understanding withheld from everyone else, and that membership in that small group is the only reliable path to real meaning or safety. The seventh message treats this pattern with particular suspicion, precisely because it appears so consistently across so many otherwise unrelated traditions, benign and harmful alike, and because it maps so precisely onto the third question above. Teachings organized around genuine, freely offered understanding rarely need to insist on their own exclusivity in order to remain compelling. None of this is meant to produce a blanket cynicism toward every tradition, every teacher, every claim of insight a person might encounter while genuinely searching. That would simply be another kind of unhelpful extreme, trading naive credulity for an equally unexamined, equally unhelpful reflexive dismissal of everything. The seventh message asks for something more demanding than either extreme. Patient, repeated discernment, applied honestly and consistently, including to ideas a person very much wants to be true, and including, again, explicitly, to this sequence of messages itself. Measure what you have heard here, the seventh message says, addressing its listener directly, by the same standard you would apply to anything else claiming to offer you understanding. Does it increase your own capacity to think clearly, or does it ask you to hand that capacity over to someone else, including whoever happens to be speaking right now? Does it rely on fear to hold your attention, or does it stand on its own, even examined calmly and without any urgency? Can it survive being questioned honestly, or does it need to stay half-hidden in order to keep working on you? This is, in its own way, the seventh message's central gift, and arguably the most immediately practical instruction offered anywhere in this entire sequence. Not a specific answer to hold on to, but a durable method for testing any answer from any source at any point in a person's life, including long after this particular telling has ended and been forgotten in its specific details. And having offered a way of testing claims for their genuineness, the sequence now turns to a related, but distinct question. If a person does manage to recover something real and worth trusting through this kind of careful, honest searching, what is actually owed to other people once that recovery has happened? Is this kind of understanding meant to be kept, quietly, as a private possession, or does it carry an obligation to be shared, even at some personal cost? That is where the eighth message begins. Message 8. What is found must be passed on. There is a particular kind of selfishness that can hide inside even the most sincere spiritual or intellectual searching, and the eighth message names it directly, without much softening. A person can spend years, even decades, doing the genuinely difficult internal work the earlier messages describe, recognizing their own capacity, orienting themselves honestly, building patiently, learning to discern the genuine from the false, and still, having done all of that real work, end up treating whatever understanding they eventually gain as a private achievement, something to be admired quietly from the inside, something that sets them subtly apart from people who have not done the same work rather than something that connects them more deeply to those same people. The eighth message pushes directly against this outcome, and it does so by returning, deliberately, to the imagery of the flood that ran through the third message. The vessel that carried life through the ancient catastrophe, this message reminds its listener, did not exist for the benefit of the people already safely aboard it. Its entire purpose was to carry something forward to a world that had not yet been rebuilt, to people not yet born, to a future the original survivors would never personally witness in its finished form. The seed, the breeding stock, the preserved skills and stories, none of it was gathered for the private comfort of the handful of people who happened to survive the initial catastrophe. It was gathered, quite explicitly, on behalf of everyone who would come afterward. The eighth message asks its listener to apply this same logic to any personal understanding gained through honest inner work. Whatever clarity a person manages to reach was never, in this framework, meant to terminate with that person. It was always, from the very beginning, meant to keep moving, to become useful to someone else, even someone the original searcher will never personally meet. This does not mean the eighth message demands immediate, public evangelism from anyone who has a private moment of insight. Quite the opposite, in fact. It explicitly warns against a related but distinct failure. The temptation to share understanding before it has actually been integrated, to perform wisdom rather than genuinely embody it, chasing the appearance of insight rather than doing the slower, less visible, and often much less flattering work of actually living according to what one claims to have learned. The eighth message describes a specific, recognizable sequence and asks its listener to be honest about which stage they are actually in before assuming they have reached the final one. First comes recognition, the initial, often startling sense that something real has shifted in how a person understands themselves or the world. Then comes integration, the slower, quieter, much less exciting work of actually living differently as a result of that recognition, allowing the new understanding to genuinely reshape daily choices rather than remaining an interesting idea held at arm's length. Only after integration, the eighth message insists, does genuine transmission become possible. The ability to actually offer something of real, lasting value to someone else, rather than simply repeating language borrowed second-hand from wherever the original insight happened to come from. Skipping straight from initial recognition to public transmission, without ever passing through the harder middle stage of integration, produces a particular and unfortunately common failure mode. People who can describe wisdom fluently, sometimes eloquently, and quote it convincingly, but who have not actually let it change how they live. The eighth message treats this outcome not simply as unhelpful, but as a kind of quiet betrayal of the entire process the earlier messages describe. Knowledge circulating without being deepened along the way, growing thinner and more brittle with every retelling, instead of stronger and more grounded. There is real wisdom embedded in this caution, and it connects to a pattern worth noticing across a very wide range of human institutions and traditions, extending well beyond this specific mythological framing. Ideas that spread only through direct, lived example. A teacher whose actual daily conduct visibly matches what they claim to believe. A parent whose calm actions under real pressure teach their children more effectively than any lecture ever could. A community whose ordinary, unglamorous practices embody its stated values day after day in small and mostly unremarkable ways, tend to have a durability that purely verbal transmission, however articulate and persuasive it may sound in the moment. Words are cheap to produce and easy to imitate without any real understanding behind them. Consistent, lived example over time is expensive in the most meaningful sense, and correspondingly, much harder to fake convincingly for very long. The eighth message frames this entire obligation to eventually pass on what has been found, not as a burden to grudgingly accept, but as the natural, almost inevitable completion of the process the earlier messages describe. A person who has genuinely done the internal work of recognizing their own capacity, orienting themselves honestly, building patiently, and learning real discernment does not typically need to be persuaded, from the outside, to eventually share what they have found. The desire to share it tends to arise naturally, on its own, as an organic consequence of the work itself. in more or less the same way that a person who has genuinely mastered a difficult skill often finds themselves wanting, without needing to be told, to teach it to someone else who is struggling with exactly the stage they themselves once struggled through. This does not mean the impulse to share always needs to be acted on immediately, loudly, or in the same form for everyone. The eighth message is notably silent on exactly what form this sharing should take, and that silence is almost certainly deliberate rather than accidental. For one person, sharing what they have learned might mean formal teaching. For another, it might mean nothing more dramatic than raising a child with a bit more patience and honesty than they themselves were raised with. For another, it might mean simply being a steadier, more reliable presence for the people already in their life, without ever explicitly discussing any of the internal work that made that steadiness possible in the first place. The eighth message does not privilege any one of these forms over the others. It asks only that whatever understanding a person genuinely reaches does not simply stop with them, sealed off and unused. Once the initial excitement of discovery has faded, there is a final, important qualification embedded in the eighth message, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than left implicit, because it guards against one of the more common distortions this kind of teaching can fall into if it is not handled carefully. The obligation to share understanding does not, in this framework, grant anyone the right to force that understanding onto someone else who has not asked for it, or to treat people who have reached different conclusions, through their own equally honest searching, as failures or as lesser than oneself. Sharing, in the sense this message intends, means making genuine understanding available and visible, through honest conversation when it is welcomed, through consistent example over time, through simple availability to anyone who happens to be asking similar questions. It does not mean insisting, coercing, or treating disagreement as evidence that the other person has simply failed to understand correctly. The eighth message closes on an image that ties directly back to the flood narrative that first introduced this entire theme of preservation and transmission several messages earlier. The survivors of the ancient catastrophe, once the water finally receded and dry land reappeared, did not simply keep their preserved seed and their carefully protected knowledge locked away for their own comfortable use. They planted it. They deliberately let it go, out of their own hands and into a wider, less controlled world, trusting an uncertain future they would not live to see in its finished form, because that release, not the mere act of careful preservation itself, was always the entire point of having preserved anything in the first place. What was carried through the flood, the eighth message says, was never meant to stay in the boat. And this brings the sequence, finally, to its ninth and closing message. Not a new theme, introduced for the first time, but a deliberate gathering together of everything the previous eight have already said, offered as a single, final address to whoever has stayed with the sequence all the way through to this point. Message 9. I see you. The ninth message does not open with a new claim. It opens, instead, with an act of attention. I see you. After 8 messages spent laying out an entire architecture of understanding, purpose, forgetting, catastrophe and preservation, inner construction, inherited capacity, cyclical time, discernment, and finally, the obligation to pass understanding forward, the ninth message steps back from argument almost entirely. It does not add a new concept to the framework the previous 8 messages have built. It simply, directly, acknowledges the person who has actually followed the framework this far. This shift matters more than it might initially seem to, and it is worth understanding why. Everything that has come before this point has been, in one way or another, addressed to a general listener, an audience assumed but not specifically known, a you that could, in principle, be almost anyone. The ninth message narrows that address, quite deliberately, to whoever has actually arrived here, having sat through 8 prior messages worth of ideas, some comforting, some genuinely challenging, some perhaps unwelcome. Not everyone who begins a sequence like this one finishes it. The ninth message is addressed specifically, and only, to the people who did. This is not a small distinction, even in a piece of storytelling like this one, and it is worth sitting with the shift in tone honestly. There is a real difference between offering an idea to an anonymous crowd and speaking directly, with genuine attention to a specific person who has actually shown up and stayed present. The ninth message tries to mark that difference clearly, closing the emotional distance the earlier, more argumentative messages necessarily had to maintain in order to build their case carefully and honestly, one idea at a time. Having marked that shift, the ninth message offers three closing ideas. Not new claims exactly, but a kind of final compression of everything the sequence has already said, distilled down into a form simple enough to actually be carried forward and remembered, long after the specific details of the earlier messages have inevitably begun to fade from memory, the way most details from most things eventually do. The first idea concerns origin. Whatever a person carries within them, the capacity for reflection, for creativity, for genuine moral reasoning, for the strange and stubborn refusal to be satisfied with merely surviving, did not originate with that individual person alone. It was inherited across an almost unimaginably long chain of ancestors, reaching back not only through recorded human history, but through the deep evolutionary history that produced human beings as a species in the first place, and further back still, through the basic physical and chemical processes that made any kind of life possible on this particular planet at all. In this sense, quite apart from any myth, every human being genuinely does descend from something larger than themselves. Not a distant planet or a hidden bloodline, but the accumulated, staggeringly improbable history of the universe finally producing, after billions of years, something capable of turning around and asking what any of it actually means. The second idea concerns place. Whatever a person carries, and wherever it ultimately came from, it was placed here, on this specific world, embedded in this specific, fragile, remarkable planet, among these specific other people, at this specific and unrepeatable moment in an ongoing, unfinished history. This is not incidental. It is, in the framework this sequence has been building across 8 prior messages, the entire and irreducible point. Whatever inner capacity a person carries was never meant to remain purely internal, admired quietly and privately from the inside. It was meant to be expressed here, in this actual, physical, sometimes difficult and sometimes beautiful world, among other people who are carrying, in their own way, something of comparable weight and worth. The third idea concerns integration, the joining together of what a person has inherited with where a person actually finds themselves, right now, in the specific and unglamorous circumstances of an ordinary life. This is, finally, what the entire sequence of 9 messages has actually been pointing toward, from its very first line. Not a single dramatic moment of revelation, arriving all at once and settling every open question permanently. A slow, patient, lifelong process of bringing together what a person has inherited and where a person actually stands, allowing the two to inform and shape each other continuously, for as long as that person continues living and continues paying attention. The 9th message closes with a passage meant to summarize the entire sequence in its most essential, most memorable form, worth repeating slowly because it draws together every earlier message into a single closing thought. "I did not make you without purpose," it says, echoing the very first message directly. "I did not make you to forget forever. What you carry was always going to be found, by you, because you were always going to be the kind of being who kept looking. Remember what you carry." That is the last line of the 9th message, and it deserves to be treated as an instruction rather than merely a poetic flourish tacked onto the ending. Not a demand for belief in any particular literal cosmology. Not a requirement to accept every claim made across the preceding 8 messages without question. The 7th message, after all, explicitly demanded exactly the opposite, insisting on careful, honest scrutiny applied to everything, including this sequence itself. Simply an invitation to keep asking the questions that gave this entire sequence its shape and its energy in the first place, long after any specific telling of it has ended and been set aside. Why are we here? What have we forgotten? And why? What is actually worth preserving when preservation becomes difficult or costly? What are we building, both outside ourselves and within? What do we actually carry, inherited across a chain of ancestors reaching back further than any single mind can fully hold? Does time move in patterns worth paying attention to? Or is that simply a comforting story imposed after the fact, onto events that were, in reality, only ever random? How do we tell a genuine answer from a false one, especially when both may sound equally confident and equally sincere? And once we find something worth keeping, what do we actually owe to the people who have not yet found it themselves? These questions did not originate with the Sumerians, whatever the deep antiquity and undeniable power of their surviving myths. They did not originate with any single culture, any single tradition, any single sacred text. They are, as far as the historical and archaeological record can tell us, close to universal, appearing, in one recognizable form or another, in essentially every human civilization complex enough to leave behind any lasting written or oral record of its own inner life. What Enki represents, in the end, not as a literal ancient astronaut, not as the secret author of a hidden bloodline, but as a genuinely durable piece of human mythology, carefully preserved across roughly 5,000 years of continuous cultural transmission, is the deep, remarkably persistent human conviction that understanding matters, that it is worth the real cost of preserving, even at real personal expense, that it is worth recovering, patiently and honestly, even after it has been lost or badly distorted for generations, that it is worth building carefully, both within a single life and across the much longer arc of an entire civilization, and that, once genuinely found, it is worth passing forward to people who have not yet had the chance to find it for themselves. The clay tablets that first carried Enki's name did not survive by accident, whatever their exact original purpose actually was. They survived because human beings, across an unbroken chain stretching from the anonymous Sumerian scribes who first pressed those wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, through the medieval and early modern scholars who slowly, painstakingly worked out how to read a language no living person had spoken in millennia, all the way to anyone listening to a piece of storytelling like this one today, have never entirely stopped asking the same handful of enormous, unresolved questions. Why are we here? What have we forgotten? What is worth saving? What are we building? What do we carry? And what, in the end, do we owe to whoever comes after us? 9 messages. Not because 9 tablets were ever pulled from beneath the desert sand in some sealed and undisturbed chamber. There is no such chamber, and there never was. But because 9 is enough to trace one honest, complete arc, from a single question about purpose, all the way through to a closing instruction about what to do, quietly and patiently, with whatever answer a person eventually finds. I see you. Remember what you carry.